Huge news for fans of dungeon crawler games or anyone who's ever desired to be a fly. FlyKnight is a new game that lets you roleplay as a heroic fly, knight, all while exploring vast underground dungeons filled with dangerous insects, treasure, and most importantly, fish made out of fruit and vegetables. Does it do the dungeon crawler genre justice though? Let's find out. My name is Johnny Bueno and let's take a look at FlyKnight. Before we jump into the game world, the first thing we get to do is make our own player-made FlyKnight. That's right, no other game has given me the chance to sit down and contemplate what my ideal fly OC would look like. Customization options include head type, body girth, skin color, and eye color. Not a ton of options, but I didn't go into this game expecting Elden Ring levels of customization for a bipedal humanoid fly. I chose steel gray skin because it looked like armor, a long suction mouth because it's funny, and blue eyes because I felt like it. With that done, it's time to be greeted by the game world. Graphically, FlyKnight's world can be described as simple yet charming. It's immediately apparent that the game leans heavily into a retro design with textures, UI, and even sound effects feeling like they came from something several decades old. And I honestly love it. FlyKnight markets itself as an old-school first-person dungeon crawler, and it doesn't seem to shy away from giving every aspect of the game that classic appeal. Your character, enemies, and NPCs even jitter around with low FPS to really drive home the feeling of being a young child again, playing games on your dad's crappy Dell desktop. Oh, and I do need to mention that I've seen many people online refer to FlyKnight as RuneScape but in first person, and honestly, yeah, I get it. Not only due to the simplistic graphical approach, but these similarities can also be heard in the sound design where the kind of chirpy noises the enemies make is very reminiscent of what you might hear in RuneScape. Not to mention the very familiar looking floating damage numbers that pop up when trading blows with enemies. Apparently the comparisons to RuneScape were so frequent that the developer even calls this out in the game credits. However, despite all these comparisons, FlyKnight is still very much its own unique experience. And within this experience are a few fairly open zones filled with hidden treasure and dangerous foes, primarily taking place underground. There is a brief outdoor area you'll journey through during the tutorial, but for the majority of the game you'll be traipsing through networks of underground tunnels, caves, and ruins. This is a dungeon crawler after all, not a surface crawler. Personally, the design of the first zone, the cave, didn't stand out to me much. There is a fair bit of plant life, some of which wants to kill you, but beyond that, there wasn't much to set it apart from your typical video game cave. The second zone, however, takes place in a swamp with a fair bit of verticality and kind of reminded me of Blighttown from Dark Souls, minus the poison. You have the option of going on the ground floor and trudging through the swamps, or staying up high and sticking to the tree houses. The swamp felt much more open and vast compared to the cave and was probably my favorite area in the game. Alright, so a quick rundown of the game's story before we jump into gameplay. FlyKnight presents its story in a very Souls-like fashion, as in you need to learn the events of the game through speaking to NPCs. There's no setup at the start of the game or long cutscenes containing info and lore dumps. From what I was able to gather from NPC interactions, you're in search of a devious villain known as Lunamoth, because Lunamoth is the whole reason you and your fellow FlyKnights don't have wings. And let's be honest, this is a great plot device because, you know, flies can fly with their wings, and simply flying over all of our enemies and obstacles simply wouldn't be fair. You'll also learn about the relationships between each species of bug that inhabit the world. We learn from one bloodthirsty wasp that his people were enslaved by Lunamoth and is looking to exact his revenge on her before you. Of course, Lunamoth is doing this all for a deeper purpose, but I'll leave it at that for now. If you want the full picture though, I do recommend interacting with every NPC you come across. FlyKnight will have you engaging in what it calls limb-based combat, which allows you to cut limbs off your enemies to change the flow of combat. For example, cutting off arms will force your enemy to drop their weapon and their entire arm. Going for the legs will force them to hop around on one leg, or crawl if they have no legs. Crush their head and they'll actually continue to live, but no longer have their senses. I like this system a lot, as it requires some quick decision making when encountering enemies. There are these four-armed enemies that hold a dagger in each hand, so you need to prioritize their arms to cripple their aggression. These beetles will hold up their shields, protecting their body, but leaving their legs exposed. Taking off an archer's head, I think, makes their shots less accurate, though I'll be honest, some arrows were getting weirdly close despite this. Different weapon types are also more effective at taking off certain limbs. In FlyKnight, there are 3 weapon types: crushing, piercing, and slashing weapons. Crushing weapons are more effective at crushing heads, slashing weapons are more effective at severing limbs, and piercing weapons are great for more precise, long-range limb stabbing. Most enemies will also just be more vulnerable to different weapon types purely from a damage standpoint. To account for this, you're given 3 melee weapon slots, so it's usually a good idea to have a weapon fit for every combat situation. I like this a lot as it means you can't just stick with a single weapon for the entirety of the game, and it promotes weapon diversity, forcing players to make sure they're properly equipped at all times. Another huge aspect of combat is stamina management, as every action you take, minus blocking, will cost you a bit of stamina. Run out of stamina and you'll be unable to regenerate it for a few seconds and wide open to attack, as your own attacks will be significantly slower during this period. So one of the golden rules of combat in FlyKnight is to always watch your yellow bar so you don't get punished for taking one too many swings without waiting for it to regenerate. This actually isn't as difficult as it sounds though, as combat and movement in FlyKnight is generally very slow. So you'll actually have a fair bit of time to regenerate your stamina before an enemy launches another attack. This even extends to drinking your healing potions, and probably one of the most drawn-out healing animations I've ever seen. The slowness doesn't bother me personally, as it makes combat feel far more methodical, and it gives players plenty of time to react. Just don't expect a frantic combat experience. Campfires, are also present in FlyKnight, taking on a system very similar to what we've seen in pretty much every Soulslike in existence. Resting at a campfire will restore the charges of your health potion and respawn enemies into the world, as well as allow you to quickly travel to other campfires you've already unlocked. Resting at a campfire does allow you to access online play to adventure alongside another FlyKnight, though I'm primarily a solo player and cannot comment on the multiplayer experience. When you feel like taking a break from dungeon delving, FlyKnight also lets you post up at a fishing hole and catch some fish that look like various fruits and vegetables. This isn't just for a chill break between slaying enemies though, as you can also eat them for various temporary buffs. This includes stamina or health regeneration, poison resistance, increased attack speed, and more. You can hold up to 5 fish at a time, so it's a good idea to keep yourself stocked up and buffed up to tackle any upcoming challenges. Or don't, because I honestly forgot I was carrying fish for most of the game and it really didn't make much of a difference in my gameplay experience. However, if you're the efficient min-maxing type, you may want to consider keeping your fish supply full at all times. Just don't go into the fishing pond because flies can't swim. One other thing I just want to praise about FlyKnight is the enemy design, which is simply fantastic. Each enemy is based on a different bug and plays into their real-world strengths. Beetles are super defensive, wasps are fast and aggressive, and stick bugs will hide in branch-like foliage to ambush you. These roly-poly dudes will also roll into you and hit you with flying karate kicks, just like in real life. Alright, there's a little bit of imagination here, but I absolutely loved fighting these charming little dudes. And it made discovering new areas and enemies all the more interesting, which made me excited to find out what I would run into next. As far as character progression in FlyKnight goes, well, there's no experience to be gained from defeating enemies and no leveling up. Character progression is strictly tied to discovering new weapons, armor, rings, and spells throughout the game world. Rather than upgrading and replacing gear, you'll be experimenting with different gear sets that work the best for you. And when I say gear, I mean tons of gear. Seriously, this is a pretty short game, but it felt like I was coming across a new item every 5 minutes or so. I was incredibly impressed by the number of different gear options I had throughout my journey, and I was constantly swapping in new weapons and armor to test them out as soon as I got them. This is just another reason I'm glad the game gives you 3 weapon slots on top of a dedicated bow slot, and I could keep my favorite weapons equipped while slotting in a new one I wanted to test out. As long as you're exploring every path available to you in each area, you're bound to find a treasure chest containing something, and I really appreciate that about FlyKnight. It never really felt empty, as there's always some sort of reward awaiting me no matter where I went in the game world. When it comes to building your gear set, weight plays a significant factor in determining what you want to equip. The higher the weight, the slower your stamina regenerates, with a trade-off and less pushback from certain attacks. So wearing heavier armor will obviously let you resist more damage, but you'll also be attacking less often as your stamina regeneration will be hampered. This does draw some comparisons to, say, the Dark Souls series, except instead of trading dodge roll speed for higher defense, you're trading offensive pressure. On top of weapons and armor, some spells, usually the more powerful ones from what I could tell, also had heavier weights on them as well. So you'll even need to factor that in if you're looking to rely on a little bit of magic. One thing to keep in mind is the defensive values of gear, as some are more effective at defending against, say, piercing attacks or magic attacks. This won't come into play too often against regular enemies, however it may come in handy for boss fights if you're paying attention to what kind of attacks they are using. Like I mentioned before, there's an insane amount of gear to collect in FlyKnight, and I like that you're at least pushed to try out different things. While FlyKnight is a short adventure, I finished my playthrough in roughly 4 hours, it left an impact on me as one of the most charming dungeon crawlers I've ever played. It embraces its roots as an old-school dungeon crawler with slow-paced, methodical combat in a world filled with an insane amount of loot and weirdly adorable insects. I felt like it was one of the more memorable games I've played recently, and despite the comparisons to RuneScape, it really does deliver an entirely unique experience, easily worth its modest $6 USD price tag. That's all for now though, so if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like or sharing your thoughts on FlyKnight in the comments below. I appreciate every bit of interaction and support as I love making videos just like this one. So please consider subscribing to support the channel, and as always, thank you for watching.